Welcome to episode 74. Today we are focusing on applicant screening and waitlist management. So let's get started. Hello everyone and welcome to the Fair Housing Insiders. I'm your host Jonathan Sarr and joining me today is Kathi Williams. Just as a reminder, thank you to all in our community who have already subscribed to our YouTube channel. We invite first-timers, please do so. It'll keep you in the loop on everything that we are doing for fair housing education. Also, sign up for our newsletter. That is another way to stay in touch with all of the content that we produce for the property management industry. For other training-related tips, as well as clips from our previous episodes and other social content, if you like Instagram, at Fair Housing Institute, and we also are on TikTok now, at Fair Housing Institute. So in episode 59, we discussed the marketing and application aspects of the new Title VI requirements. In that episode, we answered the questions, what is Title VI? And how can marketing and application procedures negatively impact certain groups of people? So if you want to know the answers to those questions, please watch episode 59. We will include a link so you can go back and check that out. Today, we are going to focus on the applicant screening and waitlist management portion of the requirements. So let's take a look at a scenario, and then you and I, Kathi, we can get into some dialogue about what we're discussing today. So the scenario, a prospect calls and inquires about their place on the waiting list. Let's listen in.
Hello, Mrs. Whitmore. As I told you the last time you called, you are listed as number 5 on the waiting list, so you shouldn't have too long to wait until we have an apartment for you.
I've been told I'm number 5 for the past 6 months. I'm starting to think you are not treating me fairly. My neighbor applied after I did, and he received an apartment within a couple of months, while I've been waiting for nearly a year. Something just isn't right.
Okay, good scenario. Nice way to provide some context to what we're talking about today. So first question for you, Kathi. Do the issues of applicant screening and waiting list management apply to all housing providers or only to federally subsidized housing?
Before we get into the specific answer to your question, Jonathan, let me just mention about the scenario. The problem in the scenario that we showed is that it is not a good idea to be telling individual applicants their place on the waiting list. It's fine to tell them that their application is in process, that you have files on it, that you're aware that they're on the waiting list, but you should not be saying you're number 2 or 4 or 10 or 100 on the waiting list. There needs to be a different way of speaking about, for instance, how long it takes to turn over your waiting list in a month or a year kind of thing, rather than to give them a place. If you do, this is going to be the result. They're going to be calling in all the time, asking, now where are they on the waiting list? So in answer to your question about screening and waiting list management issues, let me say that screening issues apply to all housing providers all of the time. So it's private market and federally subsidized and everyone else. When we talk about waiting lists, though, that's a little bit different. There is no requirement that private market housing providers keep a waiting list. Usually, low-income tax credit housing providers do keep waiting lists. And federally funded housing providers have to keep waiting lists. So if you're going to keep a waiting list, then it's important that it is managed carefully and documented constantly, because it can be the source of fair housing complaints that how this person was treated on the waiting list was not fair and someone got in ahead of them that shouldn't have. So it is important you have good documentation and policies on waiting list management if you do have a waiting list.
Very good. Thank you. Appreciate the explanation and who this applies to. So that's very, very clear to us. So let's take it to a little bit different direction now. So how can applicant screening create barriers and exclude people based on their race, color, or national origin? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, there are all kinds of ways that it can. Basically, we have to remember that screening must be done in a consistent manner and a transparent manner. For instance, one applicant who has poor credit is accepted, another applicant with poor credit is rejected. If those applicants are from different protected category, it is pretty clear that that will look like illegal discrimination. Whether it was or not, it will look like that. So that's why if you're going to accept applicants, they all are accepted with the same credit. If you're going to reject applicants, all applicants with that credit is rejected. That's the only way to prevent the appearance of illegal discrimination.
Right. Very good. Makes sense. Absolutely. So how can waitlist management disadvantage or exclude certain groups of persons from accessing housing opportunities?
One of the most important concerns are that housing providers who severely restrict when applications are taken and how they're taken can negatively impact or disadvantage certain groups of people who are in protected categories. So, for instance, only accepting applications during business hours could appear to disadvantage certain minority groups. Providing applications only in English could appear to disadvantage people who don't speak English. And as we've talked about in other episodes, that can look like national origin discrimination. And certainly requiring that applications only be taken in the office and only at certain hours of the day could negatively impact disabled people. So usually we're talking about how you prepare or create a waiting list through the acceptance of applications, and that can have a negative impact on certain groups of people.
Okay. Yeah, very good. Good, clear scenarios. So that's very, very helpful to provide some context to that question. So as we wrap this episode up, what are some best practices when establishing applicant screening and waitlist management procedures?
Okay, I'm going to be talking about a number of examples of how those can occur. And I'd like to refer all of you who receive federal funds in your housing that HUD has a pretty good document that it has prepared that lists all kinds of concerns when you're talking about screening and waiting list management. And Jonathan can tell you how you can get a copy of that from this episode. But let me just mention a couple of those best practices. And I've referred to one already, and that is, do you require applicants to come into your office to both receive applications and then drop them off? In the past, that was the most common way of doing it. I think going forward, and certainly after HUD has explained its concerns about doing it that way, you need to expand how applications are issued and received. And maybe one good example of how to expand that is to include a way on your website for someone to provide an application. That therefore they do not have to get into a car and come down to your management office to obtain or to also to return it once it's filled out. Making sure that things that you use transparency in describing eligibility criteria, and what kind of housing you're providing, and all of that is also an important part in making sure the people who do apply actually are probably going to be eligible and not have mistakes in what kind of housing you are providing. If you're going to have applications picked up and dropped off, permitting it to be done in non-business hours, it would be a good practice to expand, making it easier for applicants to apply for vacancies. Also, if applicants need assistance in filling out applications, sometimes they can be, especially in federally funded properties, they can be pretty complicated. Making sure that staff are available when people need assistance in filling it out is very important, and making that assistance easy to obtain. When you're marketing your property, and however you market it, in applications, on brochures, on your website, making it easy for people to understand the unit sizes, the amenities, the appropriate rents that you're going to expect, whether you have federal programs or subsidies, whether you have preferences that you're going to apply, making that all very easy to understand in what we often think of as lay person terms. Making sure that applications are in various languages that are likely in the area you work in, for people to use and apply, and not requiring that they only use English languages to apply for your program. And last but not least, HUD is recommending that housing providers consider using lotteries rather than date and time in the order of your waiting list. So in the past, it was almost always the date and time the application was submitted back into the office was used as the order in which waiting lists were listed or ordered. And now HUD is recommending as a best practice that instead, especially for larger housing providers, that you do a lottery. So for instance, if you're going to accept applications for 1 week during certain periods of time, that at the end of that, everybody is lumped into a category, and then one by one pulled out and listed in an order. And HUD feels or believes that sometimes that is a fairer way of doing it, so that everyone gets an equal opportunity to be at the top of that waiting list, versus when they were able to get transportation back to your office and submit the application. So there are a lot of things to consider. And the important thing is to know that HUD has guidance out there that you probably ought to review pretty carefully, especially if you do federally funded housing.
Yeah, very good. Lots of detail there. 6 key points on some best practices when dealing with applicant screening and waitlist management procedures. So thank you for that. And we will include that document, everyone. It's there because Kathi mentioned it a couple of times in her comments. Implementation sheet for HUD's Title VI guidance regarding marketing and application processing at subsidized multifamily properties. So that will be in the blog. We'll have a link in the YouTube show as well, so you can have access to that PDF and use that as a resource. So a deep topic. Thank you again. Appreciate your insights, Kathi. And thank you everyone for tuning in to our show. We appreciate your support. We love our community. Please continue to give us those thumbs up. We also love your feedback. So if there's anything that you'd like to see on the show, please reach out to us. Until next time, take care, everyone.